DNA. Ugh. Right, so I know DNA is important. It's the fundamental molecule of life, and it defines who you are. Modern biology places a lot of importance on that genetic code. But for me, a human being is so much more than just a genetic code. It's a combination of thoughts, feelings, emotion, urges. And from a purely technical standpoint, fats, carbohydrates, and protein swimming about in a load of water. You're effectively a walking, talking, sentient can of soup. DNA is apparently the recipe book for a human being, but that's not quite true. In fact, it's the instruction manual to produce proteins, and it's the proteins that go on to work or acquire all those other things like carbohydrates, fats, nucleotides, amino acids, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, everything that you need to be a human being. Now that recipe book, that DNA, it does encode in terms of us a sentient can of soup. But with minor changes, you could then become a fern, a fish, a flatworm, a fungi, a ferret, and so on. This is what we rather grandly call the fundamental dogma of molecular biology, where you go from DNA to this stuff called RNA, which then becomes protein. Now, for our purposes, we can ignore this bit in the middle and just talk about the whole DNA going to protein. Let me explain. A piece of that genetic code exits the nucleus, and it comes into contact with a rather large molecular machine. It's called a ribosome, and it's gigantic, biologically speaking. This machine latches on, and what it does is it reads that genetic code, passing along the DNA, and out the other end, spits out a bit of protein. And then, when it's done, it pops off. But at this point, you've just got a long line of floppy protein. And everything in biology is defined by its shape. It needs to fold. Now, there are three basic shapes in biology. There's random floppy loop, which doesn't actually have a shape. Or there's a beautiful helix, and you probably will have seen that before with DNA. Or there's a third one in proteins. And that is called a sheet. These are long protective regions that sort of protect the inner cores. So folding is an incredible process. We don't really understand a lot of it, and to be honest, if we did, then we would live in a utopia. We would have unlimited medicine, or the food that we'd need. But I don't know whether you've noticed, we don't live in a utopia at the moment. Now, even with our best supercomputers, we can get like a vague idea. Now, we have other ways of getting pictures, but what the protein is doing is it's folding up, hiding all of its water-hating bits on the inside and keeping all the water-loving bits on the outside. What it's doing is it's hunting for its most energetically favorable conformation. We call this falling into a thermodynamic well. And once we have a folded protein, then all the fun begins. Because this is biology, everything is a little bit squishy. And so, from one single fold or shape, the protein can actually change its conformation. Depending on whether it's really acidic outside or alkaline, whether it's really salty, or whether it's near hollowed of fat. And that's because there's a lot of conformational flexibility. Oh, look, it's a rope. So for loads of proteins, this is where their story ends. They do something structural, they hang about in the cell, they do their thing. But there's a special type of protein that I want to talk about because that's what I work on. Now, life, if you think about it, is just loads and loads of chemical reactions happening, thousands of them happening within your cells. Loads of these reactions, they don't happen fast enough for life to survive. They need to be sped up, and this is where something amazing comes along, an enzyme. Enzymes are the catalysts of life. They speed up chemical reactions. Let me show you how. Let's just take any old random enzyme. It's probably just sort of hanging out, floating around in the cell, gently pulsating. Maybe it's a bit more excitable. And then suddenly, maybe something that it wants to bind to comes along, and it changes its conformation. It binds to it, and this enzyme will then act on it and do something to it. But when it's done, it will reset and then just float about in the cell again, doing its thing. I work on enzymes called molecular motors, and these are motors in the truest sense of the word. They take in a cellular fuel called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short, and they burn a chemical bond between phosphorus and oxygen. This produces something called chemomechanical motion, which is then transferred and then used to power a reaction. For example, muscle movement. But for this bit of the routine to work, it's pretty hard to wear a microphone when you're not wearing any clothes, so I've had to use a bit of movie magic and my psychic powers to tell you the story. Muscle movement is powered by molecular motors. And within your cells is an amazing architecture, a cytoskeleton made from a protein called actin. For your muscles to do their thing, a molecular motor called myosin grabs onto this skeleton, takes some of that chemical fuel, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, and then burns a phosphorus-oxygen bond to produce a power stroke. And without molecular motors working consistently and precisely all the time, not only could I not move about in the air, I and you couldn't move at all. And what I find remarkable about all of this is that it's not just happening in me while I'm prattling about on this rope, but this is how all movement happens. And even when you're not moving, your enzymes are working, your molecular motors are doing things, your heart is constantly beating, your liver is removing toxins from your blood. This incredible dance occurring at the nanoscale within your cells is allowing you to survive and to thrive.